So Shawnee Smith from E4Life, yes?
No, we don't have Shawnee yet.
Okay.
But we do have Niche.
Okay. All right.
Is Shawnee Stewart? Yes, Shawnee Stewart.
So Shawnee Smith from E4Life, yes? Maybe echo.
Okay, we're going live on the additional channels now.
Welcome to the Jamaican leg of the launch of the Government of Canada's Women's Voice and Leadership Program in the Caribbean. Now, my name is Dion Jacks Miller. This is an exciting program that's being implemented in over 30 countries. It has immense possibilities to move women's organizations and women forward, and I'm honored to be part of this launch. A little later in the program, we're going to be having a panel discussion with 4 interesting and dynamic and knowledgeable panelists. We're going to be talking about gender justice and the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, we'll introduce our panelists a little later on, but just to let you know that they will be Amina Doherty, Kerry Jo Ford Lynn, Judith Weatherburn, and Nadine Spence. And we look forward to your input in the discussion as well, because we're hoping for a really dynamic and lively session. Before that, though, let me hand over to the High Commissioner to Jamaica, Her Excellency Laurie Peters, to introduce the Jamaican grantees.
Ms. Jackson-Miller, thanks so much. Thank you in particular for lending your very strong voice to this exciting launch today, the Women's Voice and Leadership Caribbean project. This project was launched a few years ago, June 2017, and it allows Canada to express and walk the talk, if you will, our feminist international assistance policy. It basically, what that is that Canada puts women and girls at the center of everything that we do, not just as beneficiaries, but also as agents and advocates to ensure that any inequities and inequalities are addressed, perhaps to influence policy as well, and to advance real change for women in the Caribbean. For too many years, as we all know, there has been insufficient strategic engagement and resources, specifically to targeting and strengthening women's groups to do their own work. And this lack of resources has been a key obstacle to the delivery of effective programming in the region, effective advocacy, and indeed policy. For all their impressive work, women's rights organizations and movements are constrained by these significant gaps in funding. And according to the OECD Development Assistance Committee, 38% of allocated bilateral aid was targeted towards gender equality and women's equality, but only 4% was dedicated to women's empowerment specifically as a principal objective. And so this is what we're trying to write with Canada's Women's Voice and Leadership Project, a cornerstone again of our feminist foreign policy. Here in Jamaica, we're fortunate that we're not starting from scratch in terms of reinforcing local organizations. For years, the Canadian High Commission has been funding non-governmental organizations and small organizations with big impact through our Canada Fund for Local Initiatives. We have been partnering with Jamaica, of course, in a number of significant multi-year development assistance programs that again put gender equality at the heart of everything that we do. That being said, this is a unique program with flexible funding that you will hear about. And we're delighted that amongst the many, many applicants who chose to put forward their voice and their name in search of this important funding, that we've been able to have 4 organizations here in Jamaica. And so as part of today's launch, I'm delighted to share with you the following 4 organizations, 4 of 27 organizations from 8 countries across the Caribbean who have been selected to receive funding from the Women's Voice and Leadership Program. And those organizations are in no particular order: the Women's Resource and Outreach Center, WROC or ROC, which provides outreach programs which focus on health and wellness, sustainable livelihoods, community capacity building, and advocacy. Also well known to Jamaica here, E4Life, who provides support to adolescent girls and young women who are survivors of physical and sexual abuse, and to women and children living with or affected by HIV and AIDS. The Jamaica Sex Worker Coalition is also a recipient of the Women's Voice and Leadership Project. They advocate for the recognition of fundamental human and workers' rights of sex workers in Jamaica, whilst empowering sex workers through the creation and sustaining an enabling environment. And we also have We Change, who is a recipient of the Women's Voice and Leadership. Women's Empowerment for Change, We Change, seeks to increase the participation of lesbians, bisexual, and transgender women in social justice, advocacy in Jamaica and the Caribbean. So I'm delighted that we're able to announce these 4 recipients today who've already been working very closely with our implementing partners and are well on their way to furthering their voice, enabling leadership of women here in Jamaica and the Caribbean. It would be remiss of me not to mention that this project is being launched amidst a global pandemic. And what is heartening about the Women's Voice and Leadership flexible feminist funding is that it will allow these organizations to pivot to be able to ensure that they are addressing the existing and emerging needs of women and girls in this region who are at the forefront of the pandemic, be that as caregivers, as breadwinners, as teachers and mothers as well. So I'm delighted about the timing of this launch. It couldn't be more useful. I'm also recognizing that, again, that we're not starting from a blank slate here. The fact that we've just come through national general elections here in Jamaica, that a record number of women have been returned to Parliament, both in the upper house, the Senate, and the lower house, I think gives us an opportunity to connect these voices of these women's rights organizations with the policymakers and ensure that those connections are being made, that we can see meaningful, informed policy here in Jamaica to address those gender gaps that exist all around us. With that, Ms. Jackson-Miller, I would like to pass it back to you so that a few of our recipients can say a few words, and then we can get into the important discussion that you will lead on today's launch of Canada's Women Voice and Leadership Project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, High Commissioner. So we're going to be hearing from a representative of E4Life, as well as We Change, and then the Caribbean advisor for Women's Voice and Leadership before we go to the panel discussion. So let me ask Shawnee Smith from E4Life to say a few words.
I think Shauna is going to start, if that's all right. Go ahead, Shauna.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shawnee Stewart. I'm a co-director at We Change, and we're quite delighted. We're actually happy to be a part of this Women's Voice in Leadership grant, and we're also looking forward to continuing our relationship with Astria Lesbian Foundation. For those who don't know much about We Change, I'd like to tell you a little bit about us. We started in 2015, And We Change is a feminist organization that's focused on advocating for and with lesbian, bisexual, and queer women. Initially, we started with lesbian, bisexual, and trans women, but then Transwave came along, and Transwave has been working with trans women. So it's lesbian, bisexual, and queer women. And we have been doing work as it relates to trying to engage women and advocate with women and empower women and educate women about financial literacy and advocating for social justice issues. We've also been very active in making submissions to the Jamaica Parliament as it relates to changes to the Offences Against the Persons Act, the section specifically that criminalizes abortion. We've also made submissions to the Minimum Wage Committee. We've made submissions to the changes to the Sexual Offences Act. So we have been working with parliamentarians. We've been meeting with them as well, and we don't just send our submissions. We've done stands outside of Parliament. We've also done sit-ins. We've made preparations and sent to them based on recommendations that we know women in Jamaica need, especially around street harassment and sexual harassment in the workplace. So we have been advocating, and with this fund, we know we'll continue to do more for women in Jamaica and more for the lesbian, bisexual, and queer women. Because we know that we've done a lot of work with women, but we also want to ensure that people know that we're focused specifically on, advancing the welfare and advancing the rights of lesbian, bisexual, and queer women. So we're looking forward to this partnership. We're looking forward to support from the Canadian government through the Women's Voice in Leadership Grant and with support from Astra Lesbian Foundation. So on behalf of We Change and the entire We Change team, we'd like to thank you for your support, and we're looking forward to what will happen going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shauna. I think anybody who has been paying any attention at all can attest to the impact that We Change has already had, and the kind of approach that you've taken in not just making statements and writing the policy documents, but that kind of follow through to try to get the buy-in of the policymakers and the parliamentarians, I think is so important. And certainly we hope to see it yielding a lot of fruit. Okay, so I beg your pardon, Shawnee. I'm mixing up my names here. My apologies. Go ahead, Shawnee. Not hearing you, Shawnee. Not sure if your microphone is muted.
I think the connection has dropped, so perhaps we can go to Nish and then go back.
Okay.
Sure, thank you so much. So just a quick introduction of myself. My name is Nish McLean, and I'm an advisor for the Women Voice in Leadership program. I also provide some advisory support to Astra Lesbian Foundation for Justice as well. And I'm the co-founder for Transwave Jamaica. So I really just want to take the time to just really congratulate the Women Voice and Leadership program. I think it's really important, particularly because the project bridges the gap between mainstream women's rights groups and the LGBTIQ community. I also want to extend congratulations to WROC, We Change, Jamaica Sex Worker Association, and E4Life on being grantee partners to this amazing project. I think the importance of supporting this type of work cannot be overstated, particularly when we think about how underfunded the field of gender justice is in the Caribbean region in particular. I think inclusion also is at the center of this project as we think beyond the binary and ensure that the voices of women, cisgender women, trans women, and queer people are heard, and that we foster leadership within these organizations. So congratulations once again to the Women Voice and Leadership program and the grant recipients and the wonderful support from the Canadian government on this initiative.
Thank you so much, Nish. Is Shawnee back with us? One of the wonderful things about the way communication has been developing throughout the pandemic is the way I think people have been coming together from so many diverse locations. Of course, every now and then, that means that the same technology that brings us together sometimes drops out a little bit. But I think the process has been opening up so many doors and so many avenues of communication that perhaps weren't there before. Okay. We're then going to go into.
We do actually have a representative from Rock on the call, so perhaps they might want to see if they can say a few words.
Yes, thank you, Amina. Good afternoon, everybody. Hopefully you can see my video. This is Nikki Searle from Rock, and we just wanted to thank the Canadian government and to thank the WVL for this project. It is going to make a major difference to the community that we serve. For over 30 years, Rock has been impacting women in Trenchtown, in the Kennecott region, all over Kingston and all over Jamaica through our programs. Our programs primarily focus on empowering women to create a new Jamaica, to create a Jamaica where women are able to access everything they want to at the highest level. We work primarily in areas of gender-based violence. We work with children, we work with the elderly. Our goal is to ensure that each Jamaican woman can reach her full level of success without any barriers. And for over 30 years, we've been doing that. And we just wanted to use this opportunity to thank the High Commission and to thank the WVL for selecting Rock. And we're going to be using the grant to continue the work that we have been doing for more than 3 decades. So we really thank you, and we look forward to just continuing the strong work that we've been doing.
Okay, thank you so very much. Okay, so we're going to now go into the panel discussion, and just to let those of you watching online know that we do welcome your contributions throughout, as well as we will be allotting about 5 minutes or so at the end for question and answer. We expect to wrap up at 3 o'clock. Let me introduce our panelists. We have Nadine Spence, who is the founder of the I'm Glad I'm a Girl Foundation, the Student Services and Development Manager at Mary Seacole Hall, which is, I think, still the only all-female hall at the University of the West Indies. And I have to insert here that I'm a Seacoleite and always have been proud to be one. She's a gender activist and political commentator. Judith Weatherburn is with us as well, former director of Friedrich Ebert Stiftung in Jamaica and the Eastern Caribbean, as well as director of Women's Media Watch, as it used to be called, now WMW Jamaica, and a gender and development civil society advocate. And she's also a member of the WVL Caribbean Regional Advisory Group. Kerry Jo Ford Lynn is with us, director of the Global Human Rights Initiative, Astrea Lesbian Foundation for Justice, and she's been a development professional for over 20 years. And Amina Doherty with us from the Equality Fund, project director of Women's Voice and Leadership Caribbean, and she also is a feminist activist and a member of the Association for Women's Rights in Development. So I think it goes without saying that our panelists are all extremely knowledgeable and expert in the area of gender justice and COVID-19. Almost from the very beginning, we had heard concerns emerging that in many ways the burden of this pandemic was going to rest, as it unfortunately all too often does, on the shoulders of women. So now we're about 6 months in. Let me ask you first, Kerry Jo, what's your sense now of what we found out over the past 6 months as far as this issue is concerned?
Great question. Thank you for handing it over. As I mentioned, before we started the live streaming, I am currently in Jamaica and recently finished my 2-week quarantine after coming from Washington, D.C. And there is a lot that we still don't know about COVID-19. There is a lot that across different countries at a different pace. But what we do know is that historically, in times of crises, in times of natural or man-made disasters, the people who have been most marginalized are the ones who feel the impact of such things disproportionately. And this is the case as it relates to women, as it relates to girls, as it relates to the LGBTIQ communities. We have seen across the region and indeed across the world that it has devastated livelihoods from the tourism industry, from the hospitality industry, restaurant workers, those who don't have the benefit or privilege of having contracts with organizations who are essentially hustling, you know. And then when we think about our activist organizations, most of them actually rely on voluntary staff. And so when we juxtapose that with livelihoods being devastated related to the pandemic, it really has a long-term impact on the sustainability of our advocacy organizations. And what's really challenging about that is that advocacy is something that we have been doing in the region. I'm sorry, the noise in the background. Advocacy is something we've been doing in the region. Essentially, it's unpaid labor, which women and girls are very familiar with, and it's something that has also been brought to bear in conversations in the political arena that we've been seeing. We've seen disruptions in accessing healthcare. We've seen elevated risk of domestic and family violence because now we have restrictions related to movement. People are stressed. People are staying home. We also see an increase in discrimination and stigma. And as I mentioned, you know, the concerns around survival. And so I think that the Women's Voice and Leadership Program really has come at a pivotal time because we focus on providing core support for our partners so that they are able to use this funding according to their priorities. It is flexible and it is what it is used according to what they need in this moment.
Let me bring in Nadine here because Nadine has and always has a unique perspective because she's in such direct contact with so many young women through Mary C. Cole Hall and the University of the West Indies. And I know at the best of times, Nadine, you see a lot of young women who are struggling in so many ways. What has COVID-19 contributed is probably the wrong word, but how much more has COVID-19 challenged them?
I think for me, Deon, it was the digital divide. Like that thing is real. At the beginning of the pandemic, I had to be begging computers and laptops and tablets for my students, using my own credit card to buy them credit so that they could finish school, or going on Twitter begging people to send me money so that I could send them credit. And I recognized just how much women in rural Jamaica in particular are impacted by this thing. That we've come to know, introduced into our language as a new catchphrase that makes us all look sexy when we talk about it. The digital divide, but we haven't done really anything to address it, and it still continues to today. Just last week, I had to find a laptop to give to a Seekerlite who is starting school now and didn't have anything, and I have another tablet that I'm saving for somebody else. So many of our young women do not live in accommodation that can accommodate studying. So studying from home becomes problematic. So the kind of housing that people have available to them is also critical to this business of how people survive. And food as well, you know, just the other day, I'm sure you would have seen the study that was done by Capri, and I think I got it from Deborah, which spoke to people not having access to adequate amounts of food. So those are some of the things that I have had to be intervening in with my students, you know, ensuring that they have, for a long period of time, some of them were stuck on hall and couldn't go home. So a lot of people didn't have access to food, and a lot of people went home and didn't have access to food either. A lot of people went home and wanted to come back on campus because housing was inappropriate. A lot of people went home, and even just the other day when we decided that they wouldn't open all the halls, they would just open some. A lot of people were devastated because they do not have access to the facilities to enable access to education. So those are real issues that young women who are seeking to deal with inequality through education are now being challenged by.
And of course, with UA, and I think all the schools having said they can't bring students on campus now, those questions are going beyond the 3 months that perhaps we initially thought they would last for. At the end, I'm going to be asking all the panelists, based on their experience, for at least perhaps one suggestion coming out of their own experiences that could be implemented to help to move us forward on some of these problems. And listening to Nadine, I think one of the issues is how to bring together people who want to help with people who need help, because that issue of young women needing data, needing tablets and whatever, there are people who can help, but how to reach them? You know, you tweet, but how else? Judith, let me bring you in on this. Is Judith online? Because I did want a perspective on that. Okay, while we sort that out though.
I'm here.
Okay, awesome. Let me bring you in on that, Judith. While we talk about this issue of gender justice and the pandemic, and it exposes the kind of inequalities that Nadine and Kerry Jo have been highlighting, how do we help though to bridge that divide? How do we help to bridge the gap and to take some of the load off the shoulders of the women and girls who are experiencing problems disproportionately?
Okay, thank you, Dion. Just to say that I'm extremely happy and honored to be a regional advisor for this group, simply because it is functioning, the Women's Voices Leadership Program, it is functioning on these issues. And as we are hearing, these issues are alive and very dominant in the lives of women and their families. I would just like to do one quick thing, Dion, and take us back to what in the briefs reminded us that gender justice is a human right for every person, including justice for women and girls. So when I read that, I said, why is it necessary to make this point in 2020? It simply means that the justice principle, which we accept that is the appropriate, has not been reaching most women and girls in the global south, and from what the data suggests in Jamaica. So that is where I would like to begin, and to say that the situation that both Nadine and our sister the situations they have described are included among a number of things that need to be done to enable access to justice, which in a way will help women to become more educated so that they can access information, to be more informed about their rights, and to be able to work with women's organizations that can help them to become more empowered heads of their families, which is what we really need, because we know that there are more female-headed households with a larger number of children here in Jamaica than there are for men. So what concretely could be done? What could we do to bring women in different sectors, different organizations together to make a difference? I would begin by saying we need to be sure that we are all armed with the relevant information about how the socioeconomic context that our women live in. We can talk about it generally, but to make it the point about how serious it is, we need to arm ourselves with the data, size of households, number of children, the size of the income the woman can bring in when there's a COVID. The Capri study tells us what happens. So first of all, we need to arm ourselves with that information to strengthen our argument. And there are women's organizations that can provide that support for smaller community groups, individual women, so that together they can use that information to the best advantage of the women and their families who really need it. The other thing I would suggest is we need, outside of the group of women's organizations that know each other and we know what we do, we probably need to make more of what we do so that more people know. So for example, I think I can say in a previous online discussion we had, Nadine knows about this, Sistren Theatre Collective. But yes, Sistren is still around, but Sistren has been quietly working with women in a couple of communities, let's say below Torrington Bridge, which were really affected by the lockdowns. Okay, but Sistren had a presence in those communities already. So when they learned through their own network that there were women being abused and could not leave their homes, could not reach the police station, which would normally be the first point of reference to access justice. So the women were able to use their presence, become part of the team of persons that were identified to distribute the care packages, got into the community, could get into their households about which they had information, make contact with the women, and help the women to reach places of safety. So I say that to say that there are many times like ROC and other organizations, the women's organizations are not rolling over and play dead. And what is happening at Seacole is another example. But I think enough people do not know that these things are happening, and therefore coming together to strengthen those women's organizations and hopefully give birth to more will make a difference where it really matters.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Judith. Now, I mentioned that this is the Jamaican leg of the launch, because there have been launches taking place in other Caribbean territories throughout the day, and a couple more to go. So, I know we're talking here about Jamaica, but I think it's always important to understand and to make the linkages in terms of what's happening elsewhere, especially with us here in the region. So can you give us a kind of regional perspective on the same issue? Are we seeing the same problems and issues cropping up in other countries of the region?
Thanks, Dion, and absolutely. And I want to really pick up on what Nadine was talking about with regard to the digital divide. So by virtue of the fact that both Australia and the Equality Fund are what we call feminist funders, we believe in feminist funding principles. One of the key facets of the way we approach funding is to support in flexible terms. And that has been extremely true throughout this whole period of the pandemic, in that we know that organizations do not have access to technology. Many of the organizations that were working on proposals at the start of the year had to stop because their offices closed and people do not have internet access at home. They do not have computers at home. They have it in their office space, and oftentimes they're sharing that space. So we had to be flexible, and we had to listen to what organizations were saying they were experiencing as a result of this pandemic. I think one of the other things that's really unique and what we're hearing is the importance of providing core funding. And the organizations on the call here can also tell you, for us, what that means as a feminist funder providing core funding is we provide resources to enable you to pay the rent of the space you're using, to keep your lights on, because that's also something that, you know, we're hearing from women's rights organizations, we're hearing from communities that they don't have access to funding and resources to be able to do that. I think just more broadly, what we're hearing is, you know, the pandemic is affecting the ways that gender justice organizations, women's rights organizations organize, right? Because you have social distancing protocols in place all of a sudden, where you would do trainings in community. People are now being told to do those trainings virtually. People have said that they don't have necessarily the skills and experience to do that kind of work, in addition to not having access to the technology to do it. And again, as Carrie Jo was mentioning, you know, groups that are reporting increased discrimination as a result of this, whether they be sex worker collective, groups of trans women in places like Guyana and Suriname, you know, all of these groups are reporting increased violence, increased discrimination, in the same way that we're talking about GBV more broadly across the region. I think one of the things always to keep in mind as well is that all of our organizations, and I would love to hear from other folks as well, all of these organizations are working on shoestring budgets, Dion. The money that they have is so limited, as Carrie Jo was talking about, people not even being able to pay their staff. So in the face of a pandemic where, you know, even the ability to meet basic needs is cut, many of our organizations that we rely on are facing extinction. And so the role of funders like the Equality Fund, funders like Australia, is to step in and support, to provide additional resources where necessary, and to provide sustainable funding. So these groups are being supported for the next 3 years across the region, and there are 27 partners in total. They're being supported for the next 3 years, but we also have an additional pocket of resources called our responsive mechanism that is really dedicated to support the unknowns, things that emerge as a result of, you know, who knew that we would be in the middle of a pandemic many months ago. So things that emerge as a result of, you know, I'm sorry, there's a, okay. So we are just trying to be innovative. We're trying to be responsive. We're trying to really listen to community and hear what organizations around the region are saying. And we were on a call yesterday with many of the partners from around the region, and people were saying, thank you for listening to us. Thank you for hearing our, hearing what we need and being able to put that in a funding model that responds to our needs and responds to the challenges we're facing. So, across the region, the pandemic is hitting all of us hard. I'm a mom, I have a 2-year-old. I've had to, be trying to figure out having a child at home, work, balancing all of those things. And so we know women, it's not double burden, it's not triple, it's just, we are really carrying the labor of these times. So I really think that supporting these organizations in the current moment is absolutely critical, and not just for the next 3 years, but beyond. It's something Judith and I talk about all the time. This question on sustainability, what happens next? That's a big part of what we're thinking about and how we're framing this work.
There was a point Judith made that I wanted to pick up on, because Judith, you were pointing out, you were speaking about the women who were suffering domestic violence during the lockdown, during the periods during which people have been forced to stay at home. And that wasn't one of the narratives that was very prominent in talk about COVID. So you were hearing from the business sector, who wanted more openness. You're hearing from the set of people who are calling for more lockdown. But the fact that so many women and girls were suffering through that lockdown wasn't something that was being articulated by very many people. So how best then, because do we get these voices out? What are the best vehicles? What are the best avenues to help to make the connection between those affected in such serious ways and as they say, the corridors of power, the policymakers, the legislators, those who effect change? What do you think?
So thanks for making those connections, Dion. I acknowledging that there's no easy fix, but I think we need to start with what we have. The women's organizations that we know about who are struggling, but they are doing this work, providing support and linkages for them to make known the voices of the women while protecting them, their identity, so that people can hear their voices, and that we on our side will provide pressure, I guess, for people to listen, to say, this is not a makeup situation. It is really a continuation of the stereotypical treatment of women who are heads of households or women generally facing violence. So for example, can we, whoever is listening, a young female lawyer who is interested but not sure how, can you provide support for a woman to go to a police station and ensure that she gets the justice that the system says she has a right to? But when she gets to the police station, she doesn't get it. She's taken for granted, she's laughed at, she may even be abused herself. And then for the children for whom the mother has responsibility, when the household abuse starts to affect children, that mother needs support to ensure that the children get the support. So beyond appealing to, and this is probably where us in the sector who are parts of women's organizations need to make more direct appeals to persons in the justice system that we know, in the legal fraternity, guidance counselors, who yes, maybe already are overburdened, but we can gain insight on how to treat with these issues. It is about connecting the dots you mentioned, Dion, and creating a network. Now, it is true, we're going to be doing more voluntary work that we're doing already. But the same way that women's rights and women's empowerment has increased, not enough in recent times, based primarily on women's voluntary labor and determination to improve their situations, at this particular time, we need to dig in very deep and make that happen and bring new women of all ages across sectors in the way that this project is doing to fill the gaps and create the networks that we need to happen. And these networks will have to just proceed without government support. I'm not prepared to wait on government support to get this going.
Okay. Nadine, same issue I'd love you to comment on, because again, when the institutions, including the colleges, started to go into online mode, I was frankly a little appalled at the very privileged narrative that seemed to predominate the conversation at first, that, you know, yes, let's go online, it's more convenient, that's where we should be, and, you know, it's better for everybody, without seeming to understand that, in fact, even apart from provision of devices and data, we still have young people who don't have electricity at their home. As a very basic fundamental that you need to participate in this whole digital teaching and learning. So let me share your thoughts with us as well, if you could, on how to elevate those voices as well.
I think part of one of the things we miss in Jamaica, Diane, is this idea that the typical woman or the typical young woman is not a 19-year-old going to university whose intention is to find a boyfriend and have sex with that boyfriend and go to party and go to carnival. That's the idea of a 19-year-old university student we have in our heads. The reality is far different, or even if that is the reality, it's the reality of a minor set of the young people who you find at UA, or at any university for that matter. Same way, if we imagine our idea of the women who now are mothering children and are leading homes, we have this idea of this, perhaps somebody who looks like you, Dion, or looks like me, or looks like any one of the women on this call, women who are educated, women who can make their choices and who are independent and taking care of their children. We never think about the other women, the women who are not making it sufficient fun, the women, the lesbian, bisexual, or queer woman who cannot go home, who lives on a hall of residence, whose parents make her life a living hell, which I have to deal with on hall, and for whom going home is almost feeling like a death sentence, or going to their community is dangerous. The young woman who is facing all kinds of violence in her home, including running away from abusive situations, and for whom escaping to a space of residence like this one is a way to get away from the dangers that they're facing. And how because we're not paying attention to something I'm going to use that is very feminist, the intersectionalities, the people who do not fit into what we consider to be the norm. If you do not fit into the norm in Jamaica, you get left out. If you do not fit into what we consider to be acceptable, you get left out. And there is hardly any attempt at bringing people in. For example, at the start of just the other day, a student who lived on Mary Seacole Hall got a scholarship to go to the States to study, and she'd never been to the States, and they expected her to travel, and she had all kinds of brilliant girl who graduated with first-class honors and a distinction in the master's, but she was expected to travel, and it's the first time she was traveling on her own. And she was being given the same set of instructions as one would have given to a sighted person, without taking into consideration what that would mean. In the same way, if you think about somebody who would come from a community, a random rural community, and you spoke about, or Judith spoke about not having electricity, and what that means for that person to send them home and then tell them to resume their education. A whole lot of issues got left out of the narrative. It became not a socioeconomic, but an economic issue. It became more about getting tourists back, getting the economy going, without thinking, for example, about when we lifted the back to work order, for example, they never thought of childcare. The nurseries were closed. What were women going to do with their children? You know, I as grandmother became caregiver because what else was going to happen? Caregiver to 2 children, because if you send women back to work, their children are not a figment of their imagination. They have to go somewhere. So So telling mothers, lifting the back to work order had significant implications for women and childcare that was not thought through properly. For example, the domestic workers, and Judith can point to this as well. When we told people that they needed to stay home, our domestic workers didn't know what to do because they worked in the home. And the truth of it too is that when the COVID-19 care grants were being given out, it did not take into consideration the high levels of informality in our economy and who were the people most affected by that informality. Domestic workers were significantly impacted. Household workers were significantly impacted, right? Women who live in rural Jamaica and who are not reflected on any formal employment space were impacted. And so I think unless we get to a point, Dion, where we begin to itemize, when we say women and girls, who are we talking to? The narrative that this spiel that we just said, whatever it was, that instructions we just gave, what group are we targeting and who are we leaving out? And do we care about the people that we are leaving out? And if we don't care, say you don't care about them, but if we care, what is it that they need to hear in order for them to be reassured that they are being thought about when we plan and when we come up with policies and legislative changes that we say should improve the lives of people?
Yeah. Carrie Jo, I don't think it's that, well, you can tell me if I'm wrong. I don't think it's that there is a paucity of organizations. I mean, for instance, all the colleges have student organizations. We have women's organizations. We have a number of community organizations. But what's the gap between the organizations and these unheard voices?
I think it's similar to what you were saying. It's an acknowledgement of the power differential. You know, I think that it's important to acknowledge power and privilege in anywhere we sit, whether it's privilege of being straight versus LGBTIQ, privilege of having a computer versus not, the privilege of having, you know, even the ability to pay for staff versus relying on volunteers, and the privilege of being a funder, you know, versus a grantee partner. That differential exists. And, you know, one of the things that is important for us at Australia, at Equality Fund, is that we lead with the voices of our partners. It's important for us to fund activist-led organizations. It's important for us to prioritize their needs, their objectives. And in that way, it addresses some of that power differential. It means that those voices that are typically not heard, not at the table, not taken seriously, are actually pushed forward. And that's one way to use privilege of either being a funder or a politician or someone in a place of privilege, like, you know, leaders, private sector leaders. And it's one of the things that we see demonstrated even at a global level with Canada, where they have a feminist international assistance policy. That's only a handful of countries actually have anything related to feminist, anything in their policies. And that is, while it is aspirational, because there are systems of power that, you know, go behind it that need, you know, addressing and changing. Just like in Jamaica, we need to address systems and structures of power, and we need to continue to moving that forward. I think it's important to acknowledge that it exists, acknowledge that, you know, that the issue is there, because it's too often that we are silenced, and these issues are kind of pushed to the side in place of other economic priorities. But there is an economic case for inclusion. There is mounds of research that speak to economic case for increased GDP if you empower women, if you empower girls, if you include LGBTIQ communities. And so I think that's a part of it. We have to talk about power, we have to talk about privilege, and then there's political will.
And that whole issue of privilege, Amina, let me bring you here in on this, because over the past few months of doing interviews surrounding this issue, what has become really stark as well is the distinction between the urban areas and the very rural areas. So when you're talking about a student popping into a Zoom class, teachers in rural Jamaica tell me it doesn't happen. You know, you may see 2 children and tomorrow you see another 2, which are different 2, and you just cannot make any movement. So contextualize, if you would, or bring into the framework, if you would, for me, then that whole rural experience and how much more that brings pressure to bear on these women and girls.
It's a good question, Dion. And I think, you know, one of the things that really struck me in the session we had this morning with partners speaking from Guyana was an organization in a community that said, this is our first grant. This is the first grant we've ever had. And this is the first time we've been able to access funding in this way. And, you know, I think one of the things that has been very clear for us as we've rolled out the WVL project across the region is that we cannot rely on technology as is being framed right now to access those rural communities. And so we have, you know, folks that are really pushing us and saying, no, we have to engage on local radio. We have to engage on community radio. That's the way that we can, you know, bring in community. That's what people use, and that's the way we can engage folks. And so I think that what this moment calls for us to do is to be creative, to think about the fact that if we did not have any internet at all, if we did not have any technology, how would we relate with each other? How would we engage in this pandemic moment? And so I think that's really important. I think, you know, the thing that excites me about this process is that we are able to make connections across the region in a way that, particularly in gender justice movements, in a way that hasn't necessarily existed to this point. But I think absolutely we have to think about, how do we engage with rural community? How do we go back to traditional media, whether it be through newspapers, through you know, writing columns, through radio? How do we build that in as part of this funding process and this mechanism to really reach the communities that we want to engage with? And, you know, the last thing I'll say before I hand it back is that, you know, funding is political. It's Carrie Jo was talking about power. And I think that the approach that we take as feminist funders is to redistribute that power, is to say, you know, we don't think of ourselves as implementing partners from up here. You know, we think of ourselves as working alongside organizations. And so we put resources directly in the hands of women and girl organizations. You know, we have organizations that are unregistered that say we can't even afford to be registered in Antigua and Barbuda, so we're working under the radar. Those are the kinds of organizations that we support. And they say, this is the first time, again, that we've ever received this kind of support. And so I think what's critical is to be creative, to be flexible, to provide support in ways that kind of usurp the digital technology that we're using right now, and really builds in also the use of traditional media. I think just really seeing the folks that we work with as partners, and the fact that we're learning from them. We are not funders who know everything. The work is in those hands, and that's why we're so excited for this process. As we said, you know, we're supporting 27 organizations around the region, but Dion, we received close to 80 expressions of interest from organizations doing a range of different work, whether it is, you know, providing domestic care shelters, domestic abuse shelters, whether it was work on using technology, using digital technology, work in indigenous communities, organizations working on climate change. You know, there are organizations that are doing really groundbreaking work around the region. And I think, if anything that I've learned from this moment, in addition to COVID, is that we need more resources to make this work happen, to move the Caribbean forward.
A viewer reminding or wanting to share the comment that a lot of women in rural communities don't have formal documents like birth certificates, TRN, and whatever, and that this further hinders them from participating in the formal sector. We have a question from Shawnee. What advocacy efforts will be taken to improve the enabling environment and to engage the policymakers to effect real lasting change for the most vulnerable in Jamaica? That's a serious question. Judith, let me ask you to take it first.
Well, can you hear me?
Hearing you loud and clear.
Okay, good. Influence policymakers
to effect real change.
To effect real change, not just talk, right? And not just create policies without the appropriate inclusiveness, the way in which we are speaking about inclusiveness in this space we're in now. we on the side that wants to see the relevant policies have to make up our minds to dig in our heels and do the work and do the advocacy and build support both inside of our parliaments and outside of parliaments, but particularly among the women and girls of whom both Amina and Nadine spoke, for their voices to be heard. Their voices need to be heard. I've always advocated that my work is not to speak on behalf of. My work is to empower enough women and girls to speak for themselves. So I think it was you, Dion, that mentioned about community, helping women at communities' voice to be heard.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, how about community radio stations? Rather than, which I know young people that start them in their one-room place, and they have an audience, they have a voice. How about encouraging women's groups, communities, women to buy into that as a mode of communication rather than wait on the tablet to come? I'm not saying it mustn't come, but getting the tablet and waiting on the digital divide to be sufficiently removed or reduced. In the meantime, let us use community radio stations to get women's voices out, to demonstrate what women themselves are doing, to empower them with the information they need about how to access justice. And if you're not getting it, what do you do about it? That is what I wanted to add at this point, and build the pressure, I use the word advisedly, on the outside, so that when they do table for a parliamentary committee a policy that requires submissions from the public, that it is not, there are a set of women's organizations that always do it because they know how to do it, they have the resources to prepare the submissions. Let us broaden that substantially to include far more women's organizations, in particularly from the rural areas, whose capacity can be built by engaging in their communities through radio. And if they still have COVID and they can't meet, then radio is the way to go, so that their voices can be heard, and the policymakers will be less inclined and less able to ignore or to just lapse into a bipartisan thing, and they can't agree, and therefore the policy gets stalled.
Yeah, one of the things as well is that what legislators tend to see as, landmark legislation, or very different types of legislation, or something that's very new, will get that treatment in terms of Joint Select Committee and invitation for submissions. But there are so many pieces of legislation that get passed on an annual basis that affect women and girls in so many ways, So, and I think that's something we have to think about, how to expand the advocacy so that there is a closer eye, perhaps, being kept on the myriad of other laws that are passing through, that sometimes you only recognize the impact after they have already gone through. Nadine, same question from Shawnee, what kind of additional advocacy needs to be done, to quote Nadine Sutherland, we move to action, not just bag them out?
I think we need to know what the decision-making processes are within our own political space. So for me, and I have worked it out. So I think one of the things we need to do is that we need to know all the boards. I sit on a couple of boards. Significant decisions are taken at the board level. The women who want to see change need to know the boards that affect the decisions that are critical to their survival. Whatever the board is, and whether if it's water, you need to know Rural Water Authority, you need to know NWC Board, Water Resource Authority, the Irrigation Commission, and the women need to start challenging those decision spaces to start make relevant and applicable decisions, and to think through sensibly the things they do on a day-to-day. I think our civil service has to be implicated when we talk about policymakers, who are our permanent secretaries or directors of different sections in the ministry. Because Dion, that when, for example, the Sexual Offences Act, which we debated extensively, when the Sexual Offences Act is done, when we've done the debate, what happens next? We went through the whole business with when we had the abortion debate And we waited and waited and waited. Okay, yeah, what next? We need to know who we go to at that point. And if a bill is passed and if the changes that we've asked for have been accepted, who then makes this into policy? Who then makes this into the strategic plan? Who then makes it into the operational plan? See, what we do is we have the conversation in Parliament and we make our presentations and we're done. And then we take a year or 2 years to hear back from that committee. And then when we hear back from that committee, we are not exactly sure what makes it into law and what doesn't. Then we are not sure how that trickles down to the people on the ground who actually make those legislative changes applicable to our lived realities. So I think that we really need to know how our decision-making processes work. I'm not just into targeting politicians. I want to know all of the people who become relevant to that decision that was made, who executes, who puts money to it, who takes it to that level, etc., etc. We don't know that enough. And I think that women's organizations and perhaps our funders can start thinking this through. This is a Women's Voice and Leadership program. How do we lay bare the mysteries of our political system so that all our citizens, or at least most of them, understand how a thought becomes action, how we move from talking about the legislator to something that then becomes actionable in a ministry or in an office. We haven't sufficiently explained for our citizens what that process is. And so we're always targeting the politician, but what if who we need to target is the chair of the board? Or what if who we need to target is a section head in a ministry? Or what if who we need to target is a permanent secretary? And until we understand that process, how it trickles down from the legislator to the policymaker, to the strategist, to the person who actually carries it out, then we're at a point where we are going to be severely disadvantaged by how we make the system work for all of us.
Love that idea. Now, Judith and Nadine just gave two discrete suggestions in their contributions just now. So we're just about out of time. I'm going to come to Kerry, Joe, as well as Amina for their suggestions as to how we move forward. And then I'll go back to the High Commissioner for her closing remarks. Kerry, Joe?
You know, I want to defer to the opinions, recommendations of Nadine and Judith. I think they said it well. I know we're at time, so I'll just use the opportunity to say just so much gratitude for all the amazing work that is happening here in Jamaica. It makes me hopeful. It makes me proud, and I'm so glad to be a daughter of this country. Not to like conform to the gender binary, but like similar to what Nish said earlier, but I'm so proud to be here and a part of this program and with such amazing partners. Thank you, Dion, for moderating.
And I'll be quick. I'll be very fast just to say thank you. And we are so excited as the Equality Fund to be supporting this work from these organizations, We Change Rock, etc. We believe that the organizations on the ground doing the work know best around what to do with resources. And so I'm excited. I hope I get to work more closely with Nadine. I know that Judith always is adding her voice as one of the leaders on the advisory committee for Women's Voice and Leadership. So again, thank you. And I'm really excited that this conversation is regional and is happening at all of the levels across the region. We're experiencing the same things. And so I'm glad that we're able to share knowledge, particularly strong feminist knowledge about what is needed to move the region forward. So I'll pass it on.
Let me just,
Nadine,
thank you so much, Anima.
Nadine, this is Judy. Can I just, one thing that to add to what Nadine said, resources after you legislate and your policy implementation, resources to make it happen. It won't happen without the resources.
Okay, let me just reiterate, I think 3 really strong suggestions that came out of the discussion. One, help women and girls arm themselves with relevant information about the socioeconomic context that they're operating in to better inform the conversation. And that's so important because I think there is so much of a tendency to shut down representatives of vulnerable groups, by people who have more information or different information, might not necessarily be right or relevant, but without the data and that knowledge to fight back, so to speak, figuratively, all too often, I think women and girls are silent. So that issue of arming ourselves with information. The second point about looking at the community radio stations as an effective channel of communication to help to get women's voices out and to help to build pressure as part of the advocacy process. And also helping, the third suggestion, helping women and women's organizations better understand the decision-making process at all levels, that it goes much beyond Gordon House and Duke Street, that there are many other layers that they need to understand and to try to figure out at what level to put in, which are the layers at which you can start to apply pressure that can make a decision in the eventual actions and decisions that are taken. Thank you all so very much for such wonderful contributions. And let me hand back now to the High Commissioner.
Thanks very much, Dion, and thank you to all of the participants on the screen today, but also to all of those voices and ears listening, watching, and monitoring closely this very important discussion. We started out today talking about the fact that the baton had been passed in this regional launch today, that we're joining colleagues in the Eastern Caribbean, as well as Guyana, Suriname, and our colleagues in Belize will soon be joining us as well. And I think that we can take heart in that, in reference to the previous line of discussion about how can we raise the voices, how can we affect change, that knowing that you can connect those dots, not only here within Jamaica, but also regionally, that you can learn and build upon each other's successes and perhaps avoid some of the missteps as well, is definitely an area of optimism. I think that there is a regional opportunity here to move things forward in terms of equity and equality in the Caribbean. I think the suggestions as well in terms of better understanding where some of the champions or partners are in this is an extremely valid one, in terms of looking not just at the gender bureaus across the Caribbean, but looking at the legislators in all of the areas, because of course women are affected or are agents in everything from agriculture right through to digital technologies. Here in Jamaica, as I mentioned from the outset, we have an opportunity with a record number of women in Jamaica's parliament. We need to seek them out, not just the ministers, the senators, the ministers of state, but as was mentioned, the permanent secretaries as well. And of course, we don't need to restrict ourselves to the women. We hopefully do have some strong male allies and champions for this cause there. I was heartened to hear Jamaica's Minister of Finance, Minister Nigel Clark, talking about the recovery and response to COVID-19 at the group of friends that is co-chaired between Canada and Jamaica, where he talked about the importance of having a gender lens, and that he said, quote unquote, our policies cannot be gender blind, and a gender lens in response and recovery efforts that can ensure productivity gains reach all segments of society. So I think we need to identify some unusual suspects or bedfellows, whichever metaphor you want to choose there, in order to think not just within Jamaica, not just within gender bureaus, look to corporate Jamaica, as was mentioned as well, to find those partners, allies, champions to move this forward. And I hope, if everyone doesn't already know by now, that Canada, your High Commission here and across the region, we are here to help be a dot connector and a bridge builder between civil society and government, domestically, regionally, and multilaterally as well. And we will continue to be by your side to work regionally to help shape and sustain efforts to advance the rights of women and girls here in the Caribbean and indeed around the globe with our Women Voice and Leadership project. Avec ça, j'aimerais vous remercier tout le monde. I'd like to thank all of you, and especially our masterful moderator today. And allow me just the opportunity to give a shout out to all those behind the screens on this, especially Deborah Duperly-Pinks and Tanisha Dixon as well, and Pascal Turcotte, who leads up the development team in Jamaica for us, as well as all of our colleagues at the High Commissions across the region. Thanks so much for joining us today, and let the marathon continue in terms of gender equality in the Caribbean. Merci, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.